All right. How are you doing? Today I want to talk a little bit about theories of prejudice. Specifically, I want to talk about three theories. The first I want to talk about is the authoritarianism that was sort of laid out by Adorno and his group back in the 1950s. Then I want to talk a little bit about social learning theory. And then finally, I want to say a few things about the relationship between prejudice and socioeconomic status. So let's start with authoritarianism. So Theodore Adorno, back in the 1950s, wrote a book called The Authoritarian Personality. And his argument was that prejudice exists because it satisfies certain personality needs. So people who are prejudiced against one outgroup, right? So could be a racial or ethnic minority, but people who are prejudiced against one outgroup are likely to be prejudiced against outgroups in general. So anti-Semitism is correlated with very high levels of ethnocentrism. So the chances that somebody is prejudiced only against one particular category of people tends to be a relatively small chance, very, very, very unlikely to be the case. In its most virulent form, this kind of extreme ethnocentrism, this extreme tendency toward prejudice results in what Adorno called the authoritarian personality. An authoritarian personality is not that the person is an authoritarian, but rather the person craves a kind of authoritarian figure. They in essence are looking for political movements and personalities that demand conformity and submission to authority, often through the espousal of prejudice, right? So figuring out who the outgroup is going to be, and then projecting onto that group all of those tendencies in oneself that a person doesn't like, that a person is unhappy with. So the causal mechanisms of this kind of authoritarian personality were a tendency toward projection, which again is a sort of psychological concept, and also scapegoating, right? So scapegoating is when we take out our feelings of frustration and aggression against someone or something other than its true sources, right? So in Nazi Germany, for example, the economic and political collapse of Germany after the First World War was blamed on Jews. It was blamed on socialists and communists. It was blamed on transient populations like the Sinti and the Roma. It was blamed on deviant subcultures within German society, so gays, musicians, artists, people like that were, sort of seen as decadent, corrupt influences that were responsible for the downfall of Germany. And Hitler comes along and says, our current situation isn't our fault; it's the fault of these other people, and people who were perfectly happy to find somebody else to blame for the circumstances sort of jumped on that bandwagon because they kind of craved that authoritarian figure. So again, this is all an extension of a tendency that people have to see their own group as the norm or the standard or the pinnacle, and to see outgroups, right, as not just different, but also strange or sometimes even inferior. That's what ethnocentrism is. So this tendency that people have to crave this particular kind of interpretation of the world around them, the right leader, the right charismatic leader can essentially satisfy that need to engage in discrimination and prejudice toward other groups, right? Kind of a validation of that perspective. Social learning theory is a little different. Social learning theory says that prejudice and other attitudes are learned from parents, from peers, and others with whom people, especially children, will associate, right? So we pick up these patterns and these tendencies to judge others and evaluate others from people in our lives who are important. There are three elements that social learning theory emphasizes. One, it points to the importance of the childhood socialization process. So early childhood inputs and experiences are foundational. The argument is that prejudice is learned. So you have to learn it early and you have to learn it from people who engage in it. The second thing that gets emphasized are the role that agents of socialization play. Agents of socialization, again, are just important figures in a person's life, especially the life of a child. Agents engage in a process of selective exposure and modeling. So parents who discourage their children from interacting with people outside of their racial or ethnic group or their broad social group will end up reducing the amount of information, especially accurate firsthand information that those children have about these other groups. And that creates a void, that creates a vacuum in which there is little information that would allow the child to answer some basic questions about these people who look different from them or behave differently from them. This shapes what we call the availability heuristic. Now, a heuristic, just to get a little social psychological again, sorry about that, but a heuristic is kind of a mental shortcut. There are two ways to kind of get from point A to point B in terms of coming to an understanding or a solution or a resolution of something. The first is what we would call an algorithmic process, right? It's kind of an additive step process. You step one, step two, step three, conclusion. And you can't get to step two, or you can't get to step three until you've completed step two, right? So it's sort of a necessary linear pathway. A heuristic is again, a situation in which people are pulling information from a number of different potential places and kind of synthesizing it all together simultaneously. So that's why I call it a mental shortcut. So when we make a judgment about an event based on how easy it is to recall similar events in the past, that would be, for example, an instance of the availability heuristic. The last time I had an interaction with this kind of person, these things happened, therefore these things are going to happen again, right? That's the way in which that vacuum gets filled, right? So if you don't have any firsthand information about a particular group of people, then you go to secondhand information, representations in media, the things that your parents taught you, the things that your peers and your family have shared with you, right? And so in the absence of direct information, you're going to use these other sources of insight and understanding. And sometimes those can be very, very inaccurate, right? Because media representations are often not accurate. The experiences that we have with groups of people other than our own may or may not be typical of the kinds of interactions people have with people in those other groups. So an absence of direct and accurate information doesn't stop us from trying to reach conclusions. It just means the resources we have to reach those conclusions are severely limited and attenuated. And the third theme that gets emphasized in social learning theory is the consequences of absent or present cultural forms. So again, representations in the culture and in the society around us. So if we are exposed to a barrage of negative information about a particular group, or we don't see positive representations of that cultural group, then that becomes part of that part of what we're learning to be true of that group, even though it's obviously questionable whether or not that is in fact true. So the short takeaway from all of this is that prejudice is learned, right? And that's really, really important to keep in mind. It's learned, and it reflects efforts to conform to the expectations of prejudiced others, right? If we're kids and our parents tell us that this particular group of people are not trustworthy, and we really crave the support and the validation of our parents, then we're going to embrace their view of the world because we're going to get rewarded for that. We're going to run into a lot less friction than if we take a contrary position relative to what our parents believe. So we want to conform our expectations to those of our parents or our peers or those people who are meaningful to us. So this is why children will embrace these positions and try to hold on to them too, even after they start to discover that those positions might in fact be inaccurate. This is kind of reinforced by some of the consequences of this. So for example, if prejudice leads people to avoid contact with particular groups of people other than their own, then that's going to mean less contact with those groups of people, which reinforces the misperception. It reinforces the prejudice. So our educational settings, our residential settings, where we work, things like that, all of those socialization patterns, they're ultimately going to reinforce. If we live in a segregated society, we're going to reinforce the prejudice that we're learning as young children. All right, so last thing I want to say has to do with the relationship between prejudice and socioeconomic status. Just so everyone is clear, socioeconomic status is a position within the societal ranking system, within the social class structure of a given society. And so the measures that we use to make up a person's socioeconomic status are income, wealth, and occupational prestige, right? So how much you make, how much you're worth, and what you do for a living. Socioeconomic status determines which social class you're a member of: upper class, middle class, working class, lower class. That's what socioeconomic status is. It's the mechanism that sorts you into one of those social classes. There's some data that suggests that as education levels rise, as socioeconomic status increases, prejudice declines. So this isn't just a reflection of a more sophisticated ability to hide prejudice, although that can certainly always be present. It's actually that people with greater degrees of education can process complexity a lot more easily. There's a lot less of a tendency to stereotype and oversimplify when you've become aware that the world is a big, complicated, nuanced place, and that the way that you see the world may not be the way that other people see the world, right? If you have more education, it's not a guarantee, but the likelihood that that is something that you can kind of handle, the real complexity of the social world. It becomes easier for you to be empathetic. It becomes easier for you to expose yourself to a wider variety of cultures and people, right? You tend to travel more. You spend a lot of time in colleges and universities, which tend to be very diverse in terms of the makeup of the student body. You study a lot of things that you wouldn't normally study, say, for example, in high school. So all of this stuff together, so as education increases, the tendency to embrace prejudiced positions declines for a variety of those reasons. And I think that should be about it. We'll talk a little bit next time about other ways that we reduce prejudice. There's some theories out there and some practices, and those are always very interesting, kind of a mixed bag, but some real markers of success. So that's what we'll talk about next time. So until then, take care.